Last part 4 of the chapter written by Christopher Hauke. The name of the chapter is The Unconscious, Personal and Collective. Freud had linked instinct to universal psychological phenomena when he conceived of the Oedipus complex, which also had a mythological expression long before he named it. But his emphasis was reductive and used the myth motif to merely express the ego development and particular family dynamics of a certain class of individuals. Freud even went as far as rooting the Oedipus in his own fantasy reconstruction of the father murdering sons of the primal horde in Totem and Taboo. But in the main, he specialized in the pathologies of the individual psyche, and it is to Jung we turn when we wish to grasp the significance of the modern psyche in general. Jung points out that since archaic times the collective unconscious has found its relation with and expression in consciousness through various forms of philosophy and religion. But when these forms degenerate under the pressure of rationalism and the epistemological restrictions of science, especially since the end of the medieval period, psyche has fewer and fewer symbolic or ritual ways in which it may be expressed, and then tends to get projected collectively as and where it will. A purely personalistic psychology tends to deny and distort this effect. Since neuroses are in most cases not just private concerns but social phenomena, we must assume that archetypes are constellated in these cases too. By the time he was writing the essay to be given as a talk to London doctors in 1936, history in the form of the rise of the Nazis in Germany gave Jung the opportunity to see this all too clearly. Quote, "Today you can judge better than you could 20 years ago the nature of the forces involved. Can we not see how a whole nation is reviving an archaic symbol, yes, even archaic religious forms, and how this mass emotion is influencing and revolutionizing the life of the individual in a catastrophic manner? The man of the past in us is alive today to a degree undreamt of before the First World War. And in the last analysis, what is the fate of great nations but a summation of psychic changes in individuals? More recently, the figure of Diana, Princess of Wales, and the mass response to her death have been viewed by Jungians as an example of the collective unconscious seeking an object for its projections. The view I express in Jung and the postmodern, the interpretation of realities, is the way in which Diana seemed to possess qualities which are ambivalently valued by our contemporary dominant consciousness. Human qualities that are marginalized in certain times are still present in the collective unconscious and will seek a form in which they can be expressed. This is achieved through unconscious projection, and then, as in the case of Diana, a form of taking back the projection through relating to the image, exemplified by those queuing at her funeral who said, "It is as if I knew her." The knowing of the Virgin Mary through her image worked in the same way for over 1,000 years. Jung claims in making the point that such symbols were far more common in less rationalistic times than our own. They once functioned for humans and the psyche, but have now lost their power to connect consciousness to its roots in the psyche's instinctual base, and thus retain for humans a link to nature and the rest of the non-human world. In another way, the contents of the collective unconscious can have a harmful effect on the ego and the personality when, instead of being projected out into the world, they overwhelm ego consciousness with their powerful affects and images. This was how Jung viewed psychotic delusions, and in fact the universal and mythological character of his seriously ill patients words and images convince him of the fact of the collective unconscious. Jung first published material along these lines as early as 1912. Dreams and Jung's experiences with active imagination, a type of lucid dreaming where unconscious material arises spontaneously but ego is still awake enough to observe it, provided him with further evidence. Is there other evidence for the collective unconscious? The Jungian analyst Anthony Stevens notes how innate structures which have been out of fashion for much of the 20th century due to the prevalence of behaviorism now seem to feature in many scientific perspectives in biology, psychology, and neuroscience. Nico Tinbergen found what he calls innate releasing mechanisms in animals, especially when it comes to the relationship between parents and their young. John Bowlby took this up in his theory of attachment. Noam Chomsky's ideas of deep structures in the brain which give humans the potential for a universal grammatical structure in language despite the vast surface differences in human languages seems corroborated by more and more evidence. Sociobiology and evolutionary psychology both argue for adaptive psychic structures provided over millennia of evolution, which sound very much like what Jung meant by the archetypes of the collective unconscious. Specialized learning mechanisms that organize experience into adaptively meaningful schemas or frames. In further support of Jung's views, Stevens also notes how Paul MacLean demonstrated that mammalian and reptilian parts of the human brain still function in modern human beings. He cites Michael Jouvet's sleep laboratory experiments where he showed that dreams arise from biologically ancient parts of the brain and seem to have a clear evolutionary adaptive function. However, the most up-to-date investigations into unconscious processes come from the field of cognitive science and its employment of computer modeling and brain imaging to investigate neural substrates of brain function. As Soren Ekstrom writes, the speculations by both Freud and Jung left the specific synaptic and neural manifestations of unconscious processes to be inferred. Now Lakoff and Johnson, in their book Philosophy in the Flesh, have used studies in neuroscience, cognitive linguistics, and neural modeling to conclude that most of our thoughts most of our thought is unconscious, not in the Freudian sense of being repressed, but in the sense that it operates beneath the level of cognitive awareness, inaccessible to consciousness and operating too quickly to be focused on. Jung's conception of the unconscious combined religion and science, but he clearly anticipated the time when the neurological studies would add further scientific evidence to his speculations when he spoke in England in 1935. Quote, "Consciousness is like a surface or a skin upon a vast unconscious area of unknown extent. We need a laboratory with very complicated apparatus in order to establish a picture of that world apart from our senses and apart from our psyche. Very much the same with our unconscious. We ought to have a laboratory in which we could establish by objective methods how things really are when in an unconscious condition." End quote. Cognitive science today seems to have the investigative equipment that Jung sought and which he knew would complement the 100 years of philosophical and psychological speculation on the unconscious psyche that had preceded it. Concluding thoughts. I often ask myself and my students, what would Jung have become if there had not been Freud? Would he have remained as marginal and perhaps forgotten like C.G. Soros, who so eloquently conceived of the unconscious before either of them? The reason that Jung and Freud became world famous and Soros did not seem to lie with the fact that psychoanalysis and analytical psychology are methods of treatment. With this new method of treating mental distress, initiated by Freud, Depth psychology shifted from being a philosophical theory to being an applied psychological theory that, through its methods, could enlighten and change individuals for the better. With C.G. Jung, the method goes even further, insofar as analytical psychology addresses not only individual concerns, but also the way in which these are seen, to imply a critique of how the human psyche in general has been affected by social changes in the industrialized West since the Enlightenment. Much like Nietzsche before him, Jung emphasizes how, on the one hand, modern consciousness has evolved in a specialized way, thus enabling the greatest manipulation of the world humans have ever seen. On the other hand, however, neglect of the unconscious has resulted in great losses to humanity in the way that the creative potential of the psyche is at best ignored in favor of an assumption that progress may be achieved through the application of conscious rationality alone. At worst, this gives rise to great damage arising from neglect of the relationship between humans and the world, and the failure to recognize the projections we place upon it. Thus, Jung's view of the unconscious offers a way of healing not only for the individual soul, but also for the soul of 21st century society in general. This is far from being a purely sociological project either, because Jung always emphasizes the importance of the individual and the development of their full potential in the process he calls individuation. However, in a psychology where each and every individual also carries their own share of the universal, collective unconscious psyche, each individuating subject that fosters the integration of the conscious and unconscious psyche contributes to change in a mass collective sense. In this way, I have linked postmodern philosophical and social critique with Jung's psychology, in the sense that in both the validation of subjective experience is able to stand authentically and pluralistically besides the claims of the dominant epistemologies that have relied on objectivity alone. In other way, the post-Jungian Andrew Samuels also uses Jungian perspectives to discuss the way in which our political behavior, including the politics of gender, race, and class, may be understood better, and perhaps revitalized out of their cynicism by paying attention to the psychology of the unconscious. In both cases, the use of a psychological perspective, wrongly regarded in modern times as the sole province of individual concerns, is being employed as a new tool of critical social theory, analogous to the way in which Frankfurt School theorists once used Freudian ideas. The difference is that myself and Samuels are not welding a depth psychology to social theory, but restoring and amplifying a connection already present in Jung's psychological perspective that has included collective phenomena and has driven by his need to understand the psychology of collective human behavior throughout the century in which he lived. The psychology of C.G. Jung is more vital nowadays than ever before as a way of thinking about and acting upon not only individual issues of mental distress, as in psychoanalysis, but also the wider implications of psyche in the world. By developing a psychology of the unconscious that has both a personal and collective aspect, Jung has supplied the theoretical tools which enable psychotherapists and academics in other fields like film, literature, international relations, art, and social policy, to name but a few, to offer fresh perspectives on who we are and where we are heading at the start of the 21st century. Thank you for listening. This is the end of the chapter and end of part 4 of the chapter called Unconscious, Personal, and Collective, written by Christopher Hauke.